Moving forward to Chapter 15 of the APUSH Review, the Roaring Twenties. Alright guys, when you hear about the 20s, the first thing that needs to pop in your mind, or the first word, is prosperity. And this is simply because the standard of living begins to rise in the United States. And it's particularly because more and more people begin to move to cities. Okay, as far as the evidence of it goes, you can see from the data that the economy starts to do better because a larger number of women and men are working in office jobs. There's an increased emphasis on the marketing of consumer goods. And remember, that's things that people buy for everyday use. We're not talking factory goods here. And also investment in the stock market. Another sign is the growing popularity of the Model T automobile, which was invented by Henry Ford. When you hear his name, you need to know Model T. And also the assembly line, which we have talked about plenty in class. Now, even though we have this prosperity, on the flip side of it, there are underlying signs of trouble in the economy. And it begins with agriculture, with the falling prices for agricultural products on the world market. So that's one of the underlying currents you need to know as far as this prosperity not being able to sustain itself over a long period of time. Alright, as far as Republican politics and things like that, you need to know that a lot of it at first is bent towards foreign policy, and it really centers around the fact that Germany has a huge amount of war reparations to pay to European powers coming out of World War I. Now, even though we weren't really involved in it due to our isolationist position, we still got involved with trying to help Germany pay some of these back. And one of the ways that we did it was through something called the Dawes Plan. A couple more components of foreign policy during this period. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 comes out, and basically the bottom line on it is they say, we're forswearing, or we're going to try to eliminate war in any future years as an instrument of foreign policy or of governmental policy. If you can fast forward a couple of chapters and see how well that worked out. The next is the Washington Naval Conference in 1921 and 1922, which deals with the limitation of battleships each nation could build. It's notable that Japan did not get involved in this because they felt they were being excluded because they were held to a lot more ships than England and the United States. Also, number 4, the Dawes Plan, once again, is to reschedule German reparation payments and open the way for American private loans to Germany. Moving from there to modernism, we need to look at the arts, and you will be responsible for these things on the exam. The first component is the lost generation of the 20s, and if you remember back with us talking about the 50s, obviously we're going back in time here, but the lost generation is kind of the same as the beat generation, and the fact that they're talking about it's a reaction to the the modernist, the conformity, the materialism of the culture in the 1920s. A couple of names to be familiar with for this is Sinclair Lewis and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Criticized middle-class materialism and conformity, like I said. As far as mass entertainment goes, there's 3 kinds that really come on board during the 1920s. First is the movies, second is sports, and third is radio broadcast. 20s is the era when these things really become nationwide and begin to bring the nation together in a kind of a unified culture that we haven't seen in our nation's history. Because if you go back, remember everything was very sectional in the years leading up to this. So pop culture and mass entertainment is what brings the country together in a semblance of a unified culture. Now, as this modernism comes up with movies, sports, radio broadcasting, fashions, everything else, like any other trend or thing that comes up, there's going to be some backlash. There's going to be a response to it. And in the case of this, it's something called fundamentalism. All right, basically fundamentalism, we went over it, is a literal belief in the events and teachings of the Bible. The big place where this manifests itself is the Scopes trial, which happened here in Tennessee. You can read the components of it. We've been over it in class. Nativism is next with the rise of the KKK. Now, we have talked about them before, but this is the time period or the era where they really began to hate everyone. I hate to say it like that, but blacks, Jews, Catholics, any kind of immigrant groups and things like that. Next is the National Origins Act of 1924, and the primary purpose of it, you need to know, is to put quotas on immigration. And if you go back a couple chapters when we were talking about the difference between old and new immigration, this is specifically targeted towards the new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And we talked about some of the reasons why there was such hostility towards them. Different language, Catholicism, different culture, in some cases different views on government and things like that. And also Sacco and Vanzetti. I'm not going to the background of it, but it stems from a fear of radicals and a fear of the anarchist and communist political movements coming into America. Moving to the struggle of equality with African Americans and women. You need to be aware of the Harlem Renaissance, which was basically an artistic and creative movement that came out of Harlem, New York during the 1920s. It deals with music, it deals with art, it deals with literature, poetry, you name it, it's coming out of there. One of the big components of it, expressing pride in African American culture, as you can see in the painting on the left, all of the paintings, the literary works, etc., focused on African American culture and the support for full social and political equality for African Americans. A couple of the names that you need to be able to associate with the Harlem Renaissance, the two main ones are Langston Hughes and Josephine Baker. The Great Migration, we've talked about that before, and then Marcus Garvey with his Universal Negro Improvement Association. When you see things like Black Pride, Black Economic Development, Black Nationalism, and Pan-Africanism in regards to the 1920s, Marcus Garvey is a name that needs to spring to your mind. One of the big things that he advocated was, it's called the Back to Africa movement. All right, in other words, to the idea that Black Americans should return to Africa. Moving from there to women, two main things you need to know with regards to the 20s. First, we have flappers. We hit on that a lot in class. The fashion, the music, the attitudes, the reactions to the Victorian ideals of their mothers and grandmothers. So you need to be aware of all that, as well as the information that is on the page here, as far as the short bobbed hair, smoking the cigarettes, dancing, drinking, all that. And last but not least, Margaret Sanger. You will see her on this exam, and it probably will be in reference to the advocacy of birth control. So that wraps up Chapter 15 for the APUSH review. We will move on in class towards the test, getting closer every day. Remember to go back, look at other online PowerPoints, keep looking at the book, and continue to study because you're almost there.